Welcome back to another deep dive. We love to explore these enduring questions, and today we're going way back, centuries, to meet a thinker who was grappling with some of the same things that we think about now.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating, I think, to take a look at someone who is, maybe not a household name, but really laid the groundwork for so much of the philosophy that we discuss.
Exactly right.
So we're going to be looking at Isaac Israeli,
Okay,
who lived approximately 855 to 955 CE.
got it.
Now, he was a fascinating figure. He served as a physician to the founder of the Fatimid dynasty
Wow.
in North Africa, but he was also a very crucial early Jewish Neoplatonist.
Okay.
So, we think about Neoplatonism, we think about figures like Plotinus, we think about, maybe Augustine later on.
Right, yeah.
But Israeli is someone who's really important for understanding how these ideas were developing.
Okay.
He's not necessarily known for his originality,
Right.
but he was really incredible at synthesizing ideas that were circulating at the time, primarily, Aristotelian thought, but through that Neoplatonic lens.
Right. So he's giving us this window into how people were reading Aristotle
Exactly.
in this period through this, Neoplatonist filter.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's great. And we actually have, a lot of information about him thanks to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
An excellent resource.
There's an entry on Isaac Israeli that really, goes into detail about his biography, the sources of his philosophy, his main metaphysical and psychological ideas.
He even covers, the influence of his work.
His work, yeah, and the influence that it had. And so that's what we're going to be diving into today with all of you.
That's right.
So let's just start with, who was he?
Right.
Who was this guy?
Well, as with many figures in this time period, the exact dates of his birth and death are a bit uncertain.
Yeah.
So we think that he lived for about a century, from the mid-9th to the mid-10th century.
Right.
He spent his early years in Egypt, and then he relocated to Carrion in present-day Tunisia sometime around 905.
Okay.
And as we mentioned before, he was the personal physician
Right.
to Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi, the founder of the Fatimid dynasty.
Right. And that kind of shows, the esteem that he was held in.
Yes, definitely.
The social standing that he had to have that kind of position.
It speaks volumes about his knowledge and his skills.
Right. And there's that great anecdote about him, too, about how he,
Yes.
never married and said that his books were his legacy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was dedicated to his scholarly pursuits.
So I guess we're kind of proving him right in a way by,
Right, exactly.
diving into his work now.
We're keeping that legacy alive.
Exactly. Yeah. So clearly he was very deeply immersed in the, philosophical currents of the time.
Yes.
What were the sources that he was drawing on?
Well, there's a few that are really crucial for understanding his thought. During Israeli's lifetime, there were a lot of Greek philosophical works that were translated into Arabic.
Right.
Most notably, the writings of Aristotle.
Okay.
So he probably engaged with Porphyry's Isagoge,
Sure.
which was a standard introduction to Aristotelian logic at the time.
Okay.
But maybe the most important source that we have is the Theology of Aristotle.
Okay.
Now, this was a really fascinating text. It's an Arabic paraphrase of Plotinus's Enneads.
Right.
But it was misattributed to Aristotle, which,
Right. Of course. Yeah. Back then that happened a lot.
Yeah, it was a fairly common thing.
Right.
And this text represented a real intellectual current at the time.
Okay.
Where people were trying to harmonize Platonic and Aristotelian thought.
Okay, so they were trying to find the synthesis of these two big figures.
That's right. And Israeli's work was really an early example of this type of synthesis.
Right. And the Theology of Aristotle is just such a fascinating text because it really does blend Neoplatonic ideas with Aristotelian terminology.
Yes, and it really captures, I think, the intellectual spirit of this era.
Exactly right. And speaking of sources, there's also this interesting kind of mystery about a possible lost source.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
S.M. Stern, he proposed this really intriguing hypothesis.
Okay.
He said that there may have been a lost pseudepigraphic Arabic work that actually served as a common source.
Interesting.
For both the longer version of the Theology of Aristotle and also the writings of Isaac Israeli.
Interesting.
He even suggested that the philosophical section that's appended to the Hebrew translation of Abraham ibn Hasday's The Tale of the Prince and the Ascetic,
Hmm.
might have come from this same lost source,
Okay.
which he dubbed Ibn Hasday's Neoplatonist.
That makes sense.
So this really, sparked some debate
Yeah.
among scholars.
Yeah.
Fritz Zimmermann, for example, he argued that Israeli most likely drew directly from the longer theology of Aristotle, and that Ibn Hasday might have even been influenced by Israeli, rather than both of them relying on this hypothetical lost work.
So it's like who influenced who?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we may never know.
We may never know. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it really shows you how difficult it can be
Right.
to trace.
The lineage of ideas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with texts that have been lost.
Right.
Or that have, multiple layers of translation and transmission.
It's like a, philosophical detective story in some ways.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
so we have these possible lost sources, but there's some very clear influences on Israeli as well.
Right.
Like Al-Kindi, for example.
Yes, Al-Kindi was a major influence.
Yeah.
And you can see this especially clearly when you look at Israeli's Book of Definitions.
Okay.
Both the content and the terminology
Okay.
are very similar to Al-Kindi's own work on definitions.
Okay.
Scholars like Altman and Stern, they've done a lot of really careful comparison of these texts, and it really shows you just how much Israeli was influenced by Al-Kindi.
Okay.
But it's important to note that he wasn't just copying
Right.
Al-Kindi.
Here, sure.
He was really engaging with those ideas.
Right.
He was adapting them
Okay.
and coming up with his own.
His own interpretation.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then there's also this really interesting connection to John of Damascus,
Oh, yes.
which, might not be something that you would immediately think of.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a little bit unexpected.
Yeah.
But some of Israeli's ideas about how the intellect works
Okay.
are actually very similar to things that you find
Okay.
in John of Damascus's De Fide Orthodoxa.
Okay.
Now, this is a major work of Christian theology,
Right.
and it was translated into Arabic around this time.
Okay.
It's possible that Israeli actually had access to this translation,
Okay.
but it's also possible that they were both drawing on some kind of earlier source.
Right. Some common source that's now been lost.
Exactly.
So.
So it's hard to say for sure.
Oh.
But it's a really fascinating example of how, ideas can cross.
Cultural and religious boundaries.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. And then it's also interesting that he doesn't seem to have been influenced by some of his, younger contemporaries like
Yeah.
Al-Farabi or Sadi Gaon.
Right.
So what do you think might explain that?
Oh, it could be a matter of just geography and networks.
Right?
The flow of texts and ideas wasn't
Instantaneous.
instantaneous back then.
Right.
So it's possible that Israeli just didn't have access to their works.
Yeah.
Or that, they weren't circulating
In his circles.
in his circles yet.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's one possibility.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good picture of his, intellectual influences in the world that he was writing in. So let's move into some of his ideas.
Okay.
And starting with his metaphysics.
Okay.
So he took up this framework
Yes.
from Aristotle
Right.
of 4 kinds of inquiry.
Yeah. So Aristotle had outlined these 4 fundamental questions that you could ask about anything.
Okay.
What is
Yeah,
it?
right.
Why is it?
Uh-huh.
And Israeli, he adopted a version of this
Okay.
that was actually pretty common at the time.
Okay.
He asked about existence. Does it exist?
Right.
What is it?
Quiddity.
Yeah, exactly. Quiddity.
Yeah.
What kind is it?
Quality.
Quality, yeah. And then what he called quarity.
Okay.
Why is it?
Okay.
So this was a minor variation that was
Uh-huh.
also found in some other contemporary thinkers like Al-Jahiz and Al-Tabari.
Okay.
And it differed a little bit from Al-Kindi's formulation.
Okay.
But it shows you that, even these basic philosophical frameworks,
Right.
they were constantly being refined.
Right. They're not static.
Exactly.
People are playing with them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And then, of course, you have Aristotle's, famous 4 causes.
Yes, the material, formal, efficient, and final causes.
Right. And Israeli takes these on as well, but he adds this really interesting idea of spiritual causes
He does.
within each of those categories.
Yes, that's right.
So what does that mean?
Well, it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around
Yeah.
at first, but when he talks about a spiritual material cause,
Okay.
he gives the example of genera being the substratum for species.
Okay.
So, you can think of like the genus animal
Right.
as the spiritual material cause.
Okay.
That kind of underlies all of the different species of animals.
So it's like the more general concept
Right.
that then gives rise to
The specific.
the cat, the dog.
Exactly.
Okay.
So spiritual here is referring to something that's more universal,
Oh, right,
or
yeah.
conceptual.
Yeah.
And then he talks about spiritual efficient causes.
Okay.
And his example here is the power of the celestial sphere
Right.
as being governed by the creator.
Oh, okay.
So this is a little bit paradoxical
It sounds like it. Yeah.
because, the celestial sphere is a physical entity.
Right.
But the way that he seems to resolve this paradox
Okay.
is by saying that there's an intelligence or a soul that's governing this sphere.
Okay, so there's something that's imbuing it with that's coming from the creator.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that intelligence is the real spiritual efficient cause.
Okay, so he's finding a way to put this, divine agency
Yeah.
into that framework.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Okay, and he also takes on the four elements, right?
Yes.
Earth, air, fire, and water.
He accepts those.
Okay.
So he's working within that Aristotelian cosmology
Okay.
where those four elements, they make up all of the material objects.
In the sublunary realm.
Exactly, in this world.
Yeah.
And he also accepts the explanation that they're generated through the motion of the heavenly spheres,
Okay.
which produces heat and then transforms one element into another
Okay.
in a specific sequence. So he doesn't go into a lot of detail about how these elements are composed
Okay.
in terms of form and matter.
Okay.
But it seems pretty clear that he accepted that basic Aristotelian idea.
Got it. Okay, so then moving on to, these core concepts of substance, form, and matter.
Right.
What was his take on those?
Well, his understanding of those was pretty much in line with the basic Neoplatonic interpretation
Okay.
of Aristotle.
Okay.
So substance is what exists in itself.
Okay.
And it's the subject of predication.
Okay.
Matter is the underlying principle.
Right, so that's the potentiality.
Yeah, the potentiality.
Yeah.
And then form is what gives a specific substance.
Right.
Its character and its definition.
Right, that's what actualizes it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He also makes a distinction between particular matter,
Okay.
which is specific to individual instances
Okay.
of a species, and general matter,
Okay.
which is a kind of more fundamental substrate
Okay.
that underlies everything.
Okay, now how does all of this, jibe with his theology?
Right.
Because obviously, he's a Jewish philosopher.
Yes.
He's working within a monotheistic framework.
Yes.
So how does he reconcile all this Greek philosophy with that?
Right. So this is where you really see him doing that synthesis
Okay.
that he was so good at.
Okay.
He harmonizes this Neoplatonist concept of God
Okay.
as the ultimate transcendent source of being
Okay.
with the Jewish belief in a single willful creator
Okay.
who brings the world into existence ex nihilo
Right.
in time.
Okay.
So he uses this Arabic term al-Bari,
Okay.
which means the creator,
Right.
to really emphasize the fact that
God willed it into being.
God willed it into being.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just some kind of necessary emanation.
Right, and that's also pushing against that Aristotelian idea of an eternal, uncreated world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way of reconciling these different traditions.
Okay, and what about that Neoplatonist idea of the will of the one? So did he see that as like a separate?
A separate entity.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. He didn't treat the divine will as a separate hypostasis
Okay.
in the way that some later Jewish Neoplatonists would.
Okay, like who?
Like Ibn Gabirol
Okay.
and Halevi.
Okay.
They posited this kind of secondary level of being, the mediated creation.
Right.
But Israeli, he didn't do that.
Okay.
He stuck more closely to the earlier Neoplatonic model.
Okay.
Where God's will is just part of God's essence.
Gotcha. And it also seems like he accepts this idea of negative theology.
Yeah, so he doesn't really write about it explicitly.
Okay.
But his student, Dunash ibn Tamim,
Right.
he's a big proponent of negative theology in his
Yeah.
commentary on Sefer Yetzirah.
Okay.
So scholars like Altman and Stern, they think that it's pretty likely that Israeli also held this view.
Okay, so just to kind of remind our listeners, what is negative theology again?
Yeah, so negative theology is the idea that we can only really talk about God in terms of what God is not.
Right.
Because God is so simple.
Right.
And so beyond all of our categories,
Right.
we can't really say anything positive about God.
Yeah.
So the only real affirmation
Well, we can make.
that we can make are that God exists
Right.
and that God is one.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've talked about how God creates the world, how God relates to the world. Now let's get into his model of emanation.
Okay.
So how did he see this kind of procession of being?
Right. So his model starts with what he calls first matter and first form.
Okay.
And he says that these are the very first creations of God.
Okay.
They're brought into being through a direct act of divine will.
Okay. So that's different from someone like Plotinus,
Yes.
where it all kind of starts with the intellect.
Yeah, for Plotinus, the first emanation is intellect or nous.
Right.
But for Israeli, it's first matter and first form.
Interesting.
And then those two unite to produce the first intellect.
Okay.
And from there, everything else emanates from the first intellect in a descending order.
Exactly. So you have the second intellect,
Okay.
which is within the realm of soul.
Okay.
And it's characterized by its engagement with time and with particular things.
Okay.
And then below that, you have the three kinds of soul:
Okay.
the rational, the animal, and the vegetative.
Okay, so he's got a tripartite soul.
Yes.
Right.
And then finally, you have the superlunary sphere,
Okay.
the heavens,
Right.
which is the boundary between the spiritual realm and the material world.
Got it. And he always refers to this realm as the sphere.
Yes.
Right.
Instead of nature.
Instead of nature.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
It might be a way of emphasizing that it's created and governed
By God.
by God, exactly.
Okay, so this is all very abstract.
It is.
How do we even begin to visualize this?
Well, luckily, Israeli gives us some really helpful metaphors.
Okay, great.
He uses metaphors of light and shadow.
Okay, light. We've heard that one before.
Yeah, that's a classic one.
And from Plato's cave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's a way of illustrating how each emanated entity comes from the source,
Right.
but without diminishing the source.
Right, so like light radiating out
Exactly.
from a bowl.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But he also introduces this concept of shadow
Okay, that's interesting.
to account for the increasing imperfection and materiality
Okay.
as you move further down the chain of being.
So things become more shadowy the further away they are from the source.
That's right.
Interesting.
So each hypostasis or each level of being,
Okay.
it has a lighter aspect
Okay.
that's closer to its origin,
Right.
and then it has shaded regions
Okay.
that are further away.
Okay.
And it's within those shaded regions that the next thing emanates.
Okay.
So the further down the chain you go,
Yeah.
the denser the shadow gets.
So it's more imperfect.
More imperfect.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then all of this culminates in our, material world where we experience.
Generation and corruption.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, he explains generation and corruption
Okay.
the way that Aristotle did,
Okay.
through the combination and recombination of the four elements.
Right. So earth, air, fire, and water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those are driven by their inherent qualities like heat and cold,
Right.
wetness and dryness.
Yeah.
And all of this is ultimately governed by the motion of the celestial sphere.
Okay.
But the heavens themselves,
Yeah.
they're made of a fifth element
Okay.
that's immutable.
So it doesn't change.
It doesn't change.
Okay.
So they represent this realm of permanence
Okay.
and perfection.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving inward
Yeah.
now
Mm.
to Israeli psychology.
Right.
So how does he see the inner workings of the soul and the intellect?
Well, he has this really nuanced view of the intellect.
Yeah.
He actually talks about 3 different levels or hypostases of intellect.
Okay. So we had the first intellect before.
Right.
In the emanation scheme.
Yeah.
So is that one of these? Yes. So the first intellect is the one that arises from the union of first matter and first form.
Right.
And it contains all of the forms.
Okay.
It has perfect eternal knowledge.
Okay.
And then the second level of intellect
Okay.
actually resides within the rational soul itself.
Okay.
And it starts out as a potential intellect
Okay.
that then becomes actualized through its connection with the first intellect.
Okay. So we have the first intellect out there,
Right.
and then we have a potential intellect inside of us.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then he also talks about a third hypostasis,
Okay.
which he calls the second intellect.
Okay. Hold on. So we have the first intellect, we have a potential intellect, and then we have the second intellect.
That's right.
Okay. What does this one do?
So this is the part of the rational soul
Okay.
that uses sense perception
Okay.
and what he calls the internal senses,
Okay.
like imagination,
Okay.
to gather information for the material world
Okay.
and then transmit that information to the higher intellect
Okay. So it's like the go-between
Exactly.
between the material world and...
and the spiritual world.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is where we get into some of those scholarly debates
Right.
that
Yeah.
we were talking about before.
Yeah.
So Stern thinks that this is maybe a misreading of Al-Kindi.
Yes, he thinks that Israeli might have misinterpreted Al-Kindi's idea of a first and second intellect.
Okay, but Wolfson has a different take on that.
Right. Wolfson says that this might actually be influenced by John of Damascus.
Right, because we talked
And
about...
similarity
Yeah, the similarity.
with the Fiat Orthodoxa.
Exactly. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
so what about the soul itself then?
Right.
How does he think about that and how it relates to the body?
Well, unlike some thinkers who saw the soul as being really immersed in the body,
Okay.
Israeli believed that the three kinds of soul,
Right.
the rational animal and vegetative,
Yeah.
they fundamentally remain outside of the body,
Even though they're governing it.
even though they're governing it
Yeah.
and receiving information from it.
Interesting.
Yeah, in his treatise, The Book on Spirit and Soul,
Okay.
he actually uses scriptural passages
Okay.
to argue that the rational soul can experience reward or punishment after death.
Okay.
So it survives the death of the body.
Okay.
But he's a little bit vague about what that afterlife looks like.
Okay.
And he doesn't talk about bodily resurrection.
Okay.
He focuses more on the soul ascending
Okay.
to a higher realm.
Gotcha. Okay, so, and then there's this whole other idea of the vital spirit,
Oh, yes.
which is separate from the soul.
Right. So this is an idea that he gets from Costa Ibeluca,
Okay.
who was a physician and philosopher.
Okay.
And this vital spirit is mortal.
Okay.
It's linked to the body, and it perishes with the body.
So that's what gives us life while we're alive.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he even cites a verse from Psalms
Okay.
to support this idea.
Okay.
It's Psalm 78.39,
Okay.
and it says, "He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes away and comes not again."
Right. So that's that distinction between the immortal, rational soul and then this vital spirit that's just temporary.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So how does the soul achieve perfection then, according to Israeli?
Well, he follows the Neoplatonic idea
Okay.
that the soul can attain a kind of unity
Okay.
with the higher realms
Okay.
by detaching itself from the desires of the body
Right.
and by cultivating intellectual perfection.
Okay.
So he outlines a three-stage process for this.
Okay. What are the three stages?
So the first stage is purification,
Okay.
and this involves ascetic practices, ethical conduct,
Okay.
and the study of philosophy.
Okay.
The second stage is illumination,
Okay.
and this is where the soul is enlightened by the apprehension of truth.
Okay.
And then the final stage is union.
Okay.
And in this stage, the rational soul becomes more and more spiritual
Okay.
and godlike.
Okay. So it's not a complete merging.
Right. It's not a complete merging
Yeah.
with God,
Yeah.
but it's a kind of union or a closeness.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. And then last but not least, we have free will.
Yes.
So what does Israeli have to say about that?
Well, he was a strong proponent of free will,
Okay.
and he based this on our capacity for discernment,
Okay.
for cogitation,
Okay.
and for consideration.
Okay.
He said that these are things that distinguish us from animals
Right.
who are mostly governed by instinct.
Right. So we have that capacity for rational thought.
Exactly.
Then that gives us free will.
And that gives us free will.
Okay.
He also said that our ability to reflect and to reason
Okay.
allows us to acquire knowledge
Okay.
and to distinguish between good and evil.
Right.
And that's what makes it possible for us to make genuine choices.
Right. Between right and wrong.
Exactly.
Okay. So what about acrasia then?
Right. So acrasia is this idea of weakness of will.
Right. Doing something even though you know it's wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Israeli said that when we have imperfect knowledge,
Okay.
we tend to hesitate
Right.
in our choices.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have a more complete union with the intellect,
Right.
then we can act more decisively.
Okay.
And we're more likely to act in accordance with what we know is best.
Right.
So the scholar Shalom Sadiq, he's interpreted this view as being aligned with a kind of Socratic negation of acrasia.
Okay.
So the idea is that if you really know the good,
Yeah.
you'll always choose it.
Okay.
And what looks like acrasia
Right.
is really just a result of not fully understanding the good.
Interesting. Okay, so this has been a really, in-depth look at Israeli's ideas, but let's zoom out a little bit and talk about his works as a whole
Okay.
and the influence that they had.
Okay.
So what are some of the key texts that he wrote?
Well, his major philosophical works are the Book of Definitions,
Okay.
the Book of Substances,
Okay.
the Book on Spirit and Soul,
Okay.
the chapter on the elements,
Uh-huh.
and the Book of the Elements.
Okay. And a lot of these are lost, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
The original Arabic versions are mostly lost. So we have to rely on medieval Latin and Hebrew.